everyone, this is Sahiti on behalf of Edureka and welcome to this live session on UiPath email automation. So first of all, I thank all the attendees who have joined this session. So without wasting any further time, can I get a confirmation on the chat window whether I'm audible or not? Alright, so many of you say a yes, so that's great. So now we're good enough to start. So now without wasting any further time, let me walk you through the topics for today's session. So we'll start today's session by understanding the very basic topic, that is what is RPA. After you understand the very basic topic, we'll show you how to install the UiPath, and once you understand how to install UiPath, I'll introduce you to the UiPath Studio. So I'll basically explain you the different panes in UiPath Studio that you need to understand, and then I'll finally end this session with the hands-on part where I'll show you how you can automate your tasks by making sure your emails are read, right? So I hope the agenda is clear to everyone. Alright, so that's great. So now let's get started with the first topic for today's session, that is what is RPA. Well, RPA is an acronym for Robotic Process Automation. So let's just understand this term Robotic Process Automation one by one. So when we'll start with robotic first. So robotic means any entity which tries to mimic human actions. So when I say mimic human actions, so any entity which tries to mimic human actions and perform complex tasks can be termed as robotic, right? So this task could be either, reading through thousands of emails or handle humongous amount of data, or it could be any basic task like, posting ads or any such task, right? So basically any entity which tries to mimic human actions is said to be robotic. Now to perform these actions, basically the robots need a sequence of steps to be followed, right? So these sequence of steps are nothing but the process. So any sequence of steps that lead to a meaningful activity or a task is known as a process. So just for an example, you can consider, you make coffee, right? So you follow a sequence of steps, right? You heat a cup of water, then you add 1 to 2 tablespoons of coffee, then you dissolve the coffee, then you pour hot water into the mug, and then you make sugar, and then you finally add milk, right? So these are some basic steps that you follow to make coffee, right? So process is the same thing. It's just a sequence of steps that lead to a meaningful task so that, you can automate anything. So coming to the third keyword, that is automation. So automation basically means that any entity that performs tasks without any human intervention. So when I say without any human intervention, I mean that no human being is involved in automating the task. So they don't review the task, or they don't monitor the task, or they don't do anything, right? So any task that happened without any human intervention is said to be automation. Now, if you summarize all these three terms together, you understand that, robots mimicking human behavior to execute a sequence of steps which lead to a meaningful task without any human intervention is said to be robotic process automation. So I hope, you've understood what robotic process automation is. It's just, robots mimicking human behavior who, perform a sequence of steps, and that leads to a meaningful activity. So all this happens without any human intervention, so it's said to be automated, right? So that's what RPA is. Now to implement the RPA technology, you need various tools, right? And in today's market, the top tools present are the UiPath, Automation Anywhere, and the Blue Prism. So guys, I'm going to compare the top tools. So starting with UiPath, UiPath offers a community edition that is basically a free edition, right? So basically anybody who wants to just learn how to automate tasks, or who wants to understand what is the process of automation, they can start with UiPath. But when it comes to Automation Anywhere and Blue Prism offers no trial version, but yes, Automation offers a trial version, which is I guess limited to 50 tasks, or it expires to 30 days. Right? Not only this, but if you see the UiPath dashboard, you can see that it has a very user-friendly visual designer, which makes it easy to learn and implement. So with this visual designer, you can learn how to automate this task in a really easy manner. But compared to Blue Prism and Automation Anywhere, Blue Prism also has a visual designer, but yes, it's more tough to understand than UiPath. But Automation Anywhere, you have to use high programming skills, right? So you have to use high programming skills to to use automation anyway. So if you're a person from an IT non-IT background, then you cannot use automation anyway. So if you have to understand how to automate tasks and you're from a non-IT background, then I could say that UiPath tool must be your go-to tool. And out of all these top 3 tools, the most popular tool is the UiPath tool. So if you're anybody, if you don't know how to use how to automate tasks, or if you don't know any programming skills and you just want to learn how to automate tasks, then UiPath tool must be a go-to tool, right? On the note of that, let's just install UiPath tool. So since I've already installed UiPath in my system, I'm just going to show you the steps how to install. So for that, basically you have to go to this following link. So let me just open that link for you. So as you can see, this is the link that you have to go to. So we have come to the official web page of the UiPath. So basically when you go, click on this option of start trial, you find 2 options. That is the Get Enterprise RPA trial or the Get Community Edition. So basically UiPath offers 2 editions, that is the Enterprise Edition and the Community Edition. So as I was mentioning before, the Community Edition is basically the free edition that you can use to learn automation. Once you get a good hand of automation, then you can start using automation at a production level by buying the Enterprise Edition, right? So if you have to install Community Edition, you just click on this option of Get Community Edition. Since I already have installed on my system, I'm not going to do that. So once you click on this Get Community Edition, you'll see that you have to enter a few details like the name, the email address, the company, and the various details. Once you enter that, you'll be sent a confirmation mail, and then you just have to open that confirmation mail to get your UiPath installed on your system, right? So guys, that's how you can install UiPath. So once you install your UiPath, let me just open the studio and show you how it looks. So as you can see on the screen, this is the basic dashboard of UiPath Studio that you see once you have installed UiPath. So on the left hand side, you can see the various project types that you can create in the studio, and on the right hand side are the basic processes or the basic projects that I've created at the past, right? So starting with the projects, so let me just quickly brief you guys the various project types that you can use. So basically there are 5 types of projects, that is the process, library, transactional process, the agent process improvement, and the robotic enterprise framework. So starting with the process is basically a blank project to design a new automation process. So whenever you want to design a new automation process and you just need a blank project, you use the process. The library is basically used to create reusable components and then publish them together in a library. So libraries can be used when you have automation processes and you want to add dependencies to them, right? So that's when you use the library project type. The transactional process is basically used when you have a flowchart diagram. So whenever your project has a flowchart diagram, by flowchart diagram I mean that you have a particular process. So you want process 1 to be executed before the process 2 gets executed, then you use the transactional process. The agent process improvement basically eases the task for the user by creating triggers. So triggers are created whenever you have a mouse event or a keyboard event, right? So that's when you use agent process improvement. And coming to the robotic enterprise framework, the robotic enterprise framework is basically used to create a transactional business process that follows the best practices for large-scale deployments. So whenever you want to create a project which is used to in the business processes or in the large-scale production, you can use the robotic enterprise framework, right? So I hope all the project types are clear to you guys. Now, if you want to just create a new project, you just choose any of these icons. So I'll start with process. And let's say we mentioned the name. So let's say I mentioned the name to be blank process 5 and the location to be standing same. So you can mention any location that you want, and you can mention the description process. So I'll just mention this description to be the blank process, and then I'll click on create. So once you click on create, you'll see that your project has been created where you can start automating tasks, right? So let's just wait for that. Alright, so you can see that your project has been created where you can start automating tasks, right? So that's how you can simply create a simple project. So guys, now this is how a UiPath dashboard looks like. So once your project has been created, you can see that there are mainly 4 panes in the UiPath dashboard. That is basically the top pane, the left hand side, the right hand side, and the bottom pane, right? So the top pane is basically the ribbon, the left hand side pane is the activity pane, the right hand side pane is the properties pane, and the bottom pane is the output pane. So starting with the top pane, which is basically the ribbon consists of all the tools like, the screen recording or the data scrape recording or the user events, or, you have tools to export to Excel, and you can save, and you can also have various options to debug, run, and open logs, right? So that's what is in the ribbon part. Coming to the activities pane is basically the pane where you have a list of activities, right? So everything in UiPath basically works in activities. So whenever you want an activity, let's say, we want a sequence, right? So we'll just search for sequence in the activities pane, and then we'll drag and drop it over here. So that's simple. That's how simple the activity pane is. You can just drag and drop the activities to the main area, and then you can start using them, right? Now every activity has properties, right? So if you have an assign activity, so let me just drag and drop it here. So you can see that, the assign activity has various properties, right? So that's what is mentioned in the right hand side pane, where where you have various properties for each and every activity that you can mention based on the task that you're doing. So let me tell you one thing over here. The activity that you select is the properties are shown for the activities that you select, right? Now coming to the output pane is basically used to to get the output, so you can clearly understand what is happening over here, which file has been read, what is the error that's coming, which part of the task is giving you an error, and so on, right? So that's how you have these 4 panes. So guys, this was all the basics about UiPath that you need to understand for today's session. So we have 4 panes, that is the ribbon pane, the activities pane, the properties pane, and the output pane. So guys, I hope that you've understood the basics of UiPath. Now let me just quickly shift back to my presentation so that I tell you the problem statement for today's hands-on, right? So we're going to start today's hands-on. So as I mentioned before, we're going to automate our emails. So consider a team, which let's just say we consider a team which is responsible for to only respond to the email request for the funds to be processed and then report them in the same time manually. So I repeat the problem statement again. We have a team whose own work is to to just go through the mails, and then they have to process those mails and then respond back to the mails, right? So now when you see this scenario in a large scale industry, you get thousands of mails based on the funds, right? So this is not practically possible to do it manually. You have to automate it, right? So because if you don't automate such tasks, then there could be a lot of errors, like your emails could be misread, or the information stored could be wrong, or some people can just skip some emails, or there could be a lot of problems storing each and every email's information, right? So to avoid such problems, we can just automate these tasks that I just mentioned, right? So to automate these tasks, what I'm simply doing is I'm going to use the UiPath Studio that I just showed you, and then we're going to read through all the emails. So once we read through all the emails, I'm going to store all that information in a database. So over here I'm using the Microsoft Access database. So that's how I'm going to automate the task, and then I'm going to store these values in the database, right? So before I shift back to my UiPath Studio and start automating the task, let me tell you the steps that I'm going to do first. So first I'm going to create an MS Access database file. So that's basically I'm going to create an MS Access database. Now after that, for this particular hands-on, I'm going to assume that the train fund emails are generated by a standard software. So over here I'm going to use the Outlook. So you can use any other software that you wish. So you can also use Gmail, but yes, over here for this particular session I'm using Outlook. And I'm also considering that the subject of the email and its content are in a proper format. So the format that I'm going to talk about, I'm going to show you when I open my Outlook. So they're in all the mails that have to be read are in a proper format, right? Then what I'm going to basically do is I'm going to create a rule to identify all these emails, right? So when I say rule, I mean that I'm going to make sure that all these emails which have to be read are read from a particular folder, and the emails that are in that particular folder also should have a proper format of the subject. Only then they would be read, and then they would be stored, else there would be an exception and the loop would stop then and there. right? So that's what I'm going to do. Now after that, since we the problem statement said that the team had to respond to the email also, so basically we wanted a response status. So in the database that I'm going to store, I'm going to have a column which says receive. That means this email has been processed and yes, we've got the information. And then finally we're going to just automate the complete task, and I'm going to show you how that is done so that all the emails are read, right? So I hope that the steps are clear to you guys. All right, so that's great. So now let's just quickly move on to our UiPath Studio, and then let's start with our hands-on part. So I'm going to do a fresh start. So I'm going to create a new project. So I'm going to go to process, and let's say we have this project's name to be funds example, and let's say the location stands the same, and in the description, and let's say I have hands-on, right? And then I also mentioned email automation so that it's clear. Now once I'm done with that, I'll click on create. So once you click on create, you can see that your project is getting loaded and your project is getting created. That is basically a blank project. So as you can see on the screen, a blank project has been created, right? Now before we start with the activities in the UiPath Studio, first what I said was I'm going to create a database, right? So for that, I'm going to search for access in my system. So let's just open access. After that, I'm going to choose blank database. And then over here, I'm going to mention the table values. That is basically, I'm going to choose a table, and then I'm going to have a lot of columns so that, I store all the values, right? So that's how it's going to be done. So over here, let's just say we choose the default table. So I'm going to choose this default table, that is table 1. And after that, I'm going to start adding columns. So let me just quickly add the columns, and don't worry, I'll tell you what these columns mean once I open my Outlook and also open my UiPath Studio, right? So you won't get confused. So let me just quickly add columns. So first column would be fund name. So that is basically the fund name that I want to store. Then I want to store the request type. That is basically my action, right? Then I want to store the request from. That is basically the from mail address that I want to store. Then I want to store the request status. And then I also want to store the quantity, right? So I'll just type in quantity. Right, so I have these various columns, that is the fund name, the request type, the request from, the request status, and the quantity, right? So let me just extend these column names so that you clearly see them. Right, now once this is done, I'll just go to view and choose design view, and then I'll mention the table's name. Let's say fund transactions, right? So that's basically the table name that I'm giving. And over here you'll see all the column names and their respective data types, right? So starting with the first column name, that is ID, that is basically a pre-generated column that will be used to identify every tuple uniquely in that table. So this column will basically act like a primary key. So when I say primary key, so for every column, so for every record in that table would be uniquely identified with this particular column. So since for every record that has been added, a new number has to be generated. So I've used the data type to be auto number. Similarly, I have the fund name, the request type, the request from, the request status, and the quantity, right? So I have all my column values, that is the column names and the data types ready. So after that, what I do is I'll just save this database file. So I'll go to file, I'll open save as, and then I have various options to save, right? So I'm going to choose access 2000 database. I'm doing this because sometimes what happens is when you want to connect your database file to your UiPath Studio, you get an error that unrecognized database format. That's because your access version present in your system is not compatible with your UiPath Studio. So for that, I'm just using access 2000 database, and then I'll click on save as. So I'll just choose this option yes in the dialog box. And let's say, we save it to desktop and we have hands-on. Right? So I'll just click on save. and you'll see that our database has been saved, right? So you can just enable the content and you'll see that we have a table with all these columns, right? Now since our database has been ready, let's just shift to our Outlook so that we understand what emails are being read and how the email subject format is, right? So I'll just open Outlook. Alright, so this is my email. So this is basically the email to where from which all the emails would be read, and the values would be stored in the database, right? So what I've simply done is, for this particular session, I've just created a new folder so from which all the mails would be read. So I'll just I'm sorry. So to create a new folder, what you can simply do is you can right click over here, you choose new folder, and then you just rename your folder based on your wish, right? So I just chose it as funds processing, and you can see that I have already some pre-generated emails that I'm going to read, and then and whose values will be stored in my database, right? So I have around 11 emails. Now one thing that I want to make sure is that you need unread emails, so that you don't, your database, your automation task does not get confused with which emails have to be read, right? So we must keep it very clear. We want to store only the unread emails, and once they're read, we just want to mark them as read, right? So that all those parameters would be applied in the UiPath Studio. Now if you observe all the emails, you'll observe that the subject format stands the same. That is, basically we have three parameters, that is the buy, the quantity, and the fund name, right? So buy is basically our action, that is basically our transaction type. Quantity would be any quantity that I've mentioned, and the fund name. Now all these three parameters are separated by commas. So any mail in this particular folder without this particular format would not be processed, and obviously the loop will stop then and there, and an exception would be shown, right? So that's how we can create a rule to read all the emails. This is just a general rule that I have created. You can have any rule that you want. So you can just have two parameters, or you can have ampersand, or any other symbol that you want to choose, right? So that was the basic format of the email, right? Now let's just shift back to our UiPath Studio, and let's just start automating. Now to start automating, what you simply have to do is you have to first drag a sequence. So when I say a sequence, all the tasks that you're going to perform, or all the actions that you're going to perform, are going to happen inside this sequence. That means when you execute your UiPath Studio's project, the sequence is going to get executed, right? So we'll just mention sequence, and then after that what we'll do is we'll drag a get Outlook activity, right? So I'll just search for get Outlook. So now I'm dragging this activity because I'm using an Outlook software. So if you were using a Gmail software, then you drag and drop a Gmail, get Outlook Gmail mail messages, right? So that's how you can do. Or if that is not the activity, then you can drag any activity from the packages folder, right? So in the get Outlook mail messages, what all I have to do is I have to mention the account from which all the mails have to be read, and the folder's name, right? So the account in the properties section is my present account that I'm using, that is my email ID. So I'll just type in my email ID. Right now, once this is done, you have to mention the mail folder. By default it would be inbox, but yes, since our mail folder had funds processing, we're going to mention that. So I'll just type in funds processing. Right, so you can open this and you can make sure that it's mentioned funds processing. So let's just check again. Yes, it's funds processing. Now after that is done, you have to mention all the filters. So we want to read only unread messages, so I've chosen that, and then I've chosen mark as read. So once all your messages have been read, they'll be just marked as read, and only top 30 are considered, right? So top 30 messages that you can see over here would be considered. But yes, if you have hundreds of emails, then you can limit it to hundreds of emails, as much as you want. Now after this is done, what you have to do is you have to initialize, or you have to create all the variables. So to create all the variables, we're just going to use this variable option over here, and then we're going to choose sequence. So that would be, the scope would be sequence for them. And to create a variable, you'll just choose this option of create variable, right? So let's just start mentioning all the variables. So I'm going to start mentioning all the variables, and I'll explain you why we are using all these variables. So I'll start with the array fund details. So basically I'm using this variable to be to store the values of the subject. So I'll just tell you how that's happening. So in the array Of t, I'll choose string because this is of a string array. And when I say array fund details, so as you saw in the outlook, you have these values, right? So you had three values: by 3500 and a and b. That is basically the fund name, right? So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide the subject into an array. So by would be, that is basically the action would be stored in array of index 0, the quantity would be stored in array of index 1, and the fund name would be stored in array of index 2, right? So that's how I'm going to divide the subject, and that's how we're going to retrieve and store it in our database, right? So that's the reason we're using this. Then I have to create a variable to connect to the database, right? So I'll just type in the variable's name. Right now this has to be a variable type database connection, so I'll just browse for types and choose database connection. Alright, so you can see that I don't find any such variable type, so I'll just close this. And now what you have to do is you have to install them. So you have to install those packages. So you go to manage packages option, and then you can start searching for the packages that you want to install, right? So basically, since we are connecting to a database, we need a database activity. So I'll search for UiPath.database. Alright, so it's okay, let's just quickly search. Yes, so I'm going to choose this arrow option over here to install the package. So that would be chosen, and after that I also want to choose the Microsoft Activities extension package because I'm using MS Access database, right? So I'm going to use search for Microsoft Access extension. Alright, so I'm going to just click on this arrow. So once I choose the packages that I want to install, I'll click on save. Once you click on save, you can see that your dependencies are getting downloaded for the project. So let's just wait for that. Alright, so you can see that all your dependencies have been added to the project, right? So now let's just again go to the variable section, and then let's search for database connection, right? So we'll go to browse for types and search for database. And you can see you can see that we have database connection, right? So we'll just click on OK. So that's how you can use this variable type. Next, we're going to create another variable for counting for mentioning all the tuples, or you can say all to get the output of the database. So I'm going to use this particular variable for that, and let's say it to be of int type. Then we're going to create variables to list all the emails which have to be read, right? So for that, I'm going to choose the name to be list fund emails, and then we have to mention it to be of list type. So we'll browse for types, we'll search list, and you see an option of list of t, right? So in that we have to choose the option of system.net.mail message, because that is what we want to be that is what we want to read, that is mail. So I'll just type in for mail message. Alright, so I'll just select this, and then I'll click on OK. So once I click on OK, this particular variable is also created. So let me just again expand this and show you, right? Now after that, I'm going to create variables to to read the from address, that is the from email address, the email subject, and also store the fund transaction type, the fund quantity, and also the fund name, right? Now apart from these, so I'm also going to create another variable for the string query. So first let me just create these variables. So for the from email address, I'm going to create a variable saying string from email to be of string type. Now similarly, I'll create for the email subject, again to be of string type. Then we have a variable for string fund transaction type, again of string type. Then we have variable for fund quantity, okay, spelling, again of string type. Then we have string fund name to be of string type again. Now apart from this, as I mentioned, we are going to create a variable to assign to the query that we're going to use to insert the values into the table. So I'm going to just create a variable saying string query, again of string type. And finally we're going to create one more variable of int type, so that it counts the number of values into the array, right? So in our case we have maximum value to be 3, that is 0 1 2, right? So we're going to use this variable so that we do not get an exception of array range out of bound. So I'm just going to create this variable, and let's say it to be of int type, right? So now once the variables have been created, what you can simply do is you just have to start using them, right? But before that, let me just summarize these variables for you again. So we've created the array fun details variable that of string array type to store all the subject values, that is basically the email subject value as an array. So array of index 0 would store this particular value, array of index 1 would store this particular value, and array of index 2 would store this particular value. After that, we would store we've used a variable to connect to the database, and then we have used a variable to store all the values, or to print out all the values that we have stored in the database. Then we have used and we've created a variable to to list all the mail messages, so it's of a list type. And then we have created variables for to read the from email address, the subject, the transaction type, the quantity, and the fund name. Similarly, we've again created a variable to be assigned to the query, which has to be used to insert values into the table. And then finally we have created a variable to avoid the array range out of bound exception, right? So now let's just start using these variables. So go to the get outlook mail message. You have to mention in the output of list fund emails, right? So what's basically happening over here is that all the emails present in this particular folder would be read from this particular account, and they would be stored, and then once they are read, they would be marked as read, and only top 30 would be read. And all these output, like all the information that is extracted from there, would be stored in the variable list fund emails, right? Now what will happen is, for every item in list fund emails, we want a set of actions to be performed, right? So for that we have to use the for each workflow. So I'll just search for each, and then I'll drag and drop it over here. Alright, so now let me just, alright, just 1 minute. Yes, so now what we can do is we have to mention for each item in list fund emails, that is for each item in every mail, we need to perform few actions, right? So I'm going to mention that. So quickly I'm going to drag some assign activities, and I'll then show you why am I dragging so many assign activities, right? So that's basically, I'm going to assign all the variables that we created to some values. So I've dragged around 7 activities, so I'll tell you what is happening with this. So starting with the first assign activity, what I'm going to do is I'm going to assign the from email address. So that is basically the first value that we want to be read. So we want to store the from email address, and then we want it to be retrieved, right? Now before we start with that, one more thing that you have to mention over here is, in the type argument you have to choose system.net.mail message. Only then you would be able to retrieve all the information from the mails, right? So we'll start with the first assign, that is basically the string from email. So we'll use that variable, and then we'll use for every item, that is item dot from, that is basically from address would be retrieved, right? So we're going to mention address. So I'll just choose address over here, right? Now similarly I want to retrieve the email subject also, so I'll just assign to this particular variable, that is string email subject would be assigned to for every item in subject, right? So what's happening is, for every item, that is for every email, the subject would also be retrieved and would be stored in this particular variable, right? Now after that, after the subject has been retrieved, we want to store it in an array, right? So what we'll do is we'll use this array fun details, and then we'll assign it to and then we'll assign it to the string email subject. But yes, there's one more thing you have to remember over here. If you see the string email subject, that is basically the subject of the email, you'll observe the commas, right? So all the values have been separated with the commas, and all of them have to be stored in an array, right? So you have to mention this splitting of commas. So for that you have to use the split operator. So since I've already stored it over here, so I'm just going to copy this, and then I'm going to paste it over here. So don't worry, I'll explain you. So let me just open this and show you. So what I've done is I've used the string email subject variable, and then I've used the split operator. And for new string, that is basically for every new string or every string that is in front of the comma or after the comma would be considered as an array value. So that's what I've mentioned over here. Now after this is done, we have to store all the values into the array, right? Now but before that, you have to use the variable of array item count so that you avoid the exception. So I'll just use array item count, and then I'll mention it to the and then I'll assign it to the length of the array. So I'll just use array fund details dot length, right? Now once this is done, again we are going to assign the values of array index 0, 1, 2. So when you open your Outlook, you can see that array index of 0 would be assigned to fund transaction type, array index of 1 would be assigned to the quantity, and array index of 2 would be assigned to the fund name, right? So let me just quickly do that. So let's say string fund transaction type would be assigned to array index of 0, right? So I'll just mention 0. Now similarly, you have to mention the quantity. So I'm using this fund quantity variable, and then I'll use array index of 1. And over here, I'll use string fund name. I'll use array fund details of 2. Right? So that's how you can store basically. So this is how basically I've used all the assign activities. So what I've done is for each item in every email that has been read, a set of activities will be performed. So the email address would be retrieved, the subject would be retrieved, and then the subject retrieve would be stored in an array. And to avoid this array range out of bound exception, I've used this particular variable, and then I've assigned it to the length of the array. And after that, we have assigned the array of index 0 to be a fund transaction type, array of index 1 to be of quantity, and then array of index 2 to be assigned to be the name, right? So that's how I've assigned all the values. Now after this is done, you have to connect to the database, right? So that is basically the database that you have created. But before that, you have to execute the query, right? So for that, what you'll do is we'll first create a sequence that is basically a subsequence, and then I'll drag and drop it over here. And after that, I'll just search for the assign activity, and then again drag and drop it over here. Now what I'll do is I'll basically assign the string query variable that I've created to to be used for this particular, for inserting the query. So I'll just say string query, and then I'll mention the expression, right? So since I've already saved it over here, I'll just copy this, and then I'll choose this option, choose the 3 dots, and then paste it over here. So what's basically happening is, let me just expand this section so that you clearly see. Alright, so what's basically happening is you can insert into the fund transactions, that is basically a table's name. So if you see, we have that as a table's name, that is fund transactions. So that's what we're going to insert. So we're going to insert into this table, and then we have the names, right? That is the fund name, the request type, the request from, request status, and the quantity. So let's just quickly check that. That is the fund name, request type, request from, request status, quantity, right? So that's basically the columns that we have. Now we'll use the keyword values, and then over here we'll mention all the values, right? So since we do not have any static values, and all the values will be assigned to the variables, we have mentioned all the variable names that we've used. That is the fund name, the fund transaction type, the fund email, and then we've used this keyword received and fund quantity. So this received text is used as a response to this particular request status column. So as soon as the information is received into this database, that is basically we get all this information, we also get a response that a response status that it is received, and the quantity would be displayed, right? So that's how you can insert this, you can use this query to insert values into the table. So if you have to understand in simple SQL form, it's basically insert into the table's name, and you have the column's name, values, and you have all the values which have to be inserted into the respective columns, right? So I hope that I'm clear with this. Now I'll just click on OK, and we have we've put the query. Now we have just assigned this query to a specific variable, right? But before this query starts running, we have to connect to the database. So for that, you'll use the connect activity. So I'll just search for connect, and then you'll drag and drop it over here. So once you drag and drop it over here, you have to configure your connection, right? So you'll just choose configure connection. You'll go to connection wizard, and then you'll choose Microsoft Access database file. I'm choosing this file because I'm using an MS Access database file. Well, if you're using any other data source like the ODBC data source or the SQL Server or the SQL Server database file or any other file, then you can use with respect to that. So I'm going to use Microsoft Access database file. So I'll just choose this option and then I'll click on OK. Now once I click on OK, I have to connect to the database that I previously created. So I'll go to browse, and then I'll just go to desktop and choose hands-on. That's what I created, right? So I'll just click on open. So once I click on open, we've given the path name. We've given the path to the database file name. Now after that, you can also mention the username and password to make sure your database is secure. In this section, I'm not going to do it. So I'll just click on test connection after that. So if it says test connection succeeded, that means your database is ready to get connected to the UiPath Studio, right? So now in this scenario, if you get an error that the UiPath does not recognize the database, or the database format is not recognized, that means there's a problem with your Access version, right? So you just change your Access version, which is compatible with your UiPath Studio's version, and then this connection would be successful. I'm sorry. So since our connection is successful, I'll just click on OK. Now once I click on OK, I'll again click on OK, and then I'll choose this option to be of system.data.oledb. So I'm going to choose this option because I'm using a Microsoft Access database file. If you were using an Oracle client or an SQL client, or if you were using a MySQL database, then you would choose the options accordingly. So I'm going to choose this option, and then I'll click on OK. Alright, so let me just quickly choose it again. It was not selected. Alright, so that's how you can connect. Now in the output section, you have to mention the database which has to get connected, right? So over here, what we've done is we've mentioned the path of the database. We haven't mentioned the database variable name anywhere, right? So that's where you have to connect. So in the output section of the connect activity, you can just mention the database. So I'll just mention the database connect fund traits. That is basically the variable that is used to create the database. And over here, let's say, I rename the sequence so that, it's clear. So I'll just type in db connect sequence, right? So that's basically, it makes it clear for you guys to understand what exactly we're doing in the subsequence. Now once your database is ready to get connected, what you also have to make sure is that your query is executed, right? Now since we've assigned our query to a variable, we can use a non-query to execute. So we'll just use non-query execute activity. So I'll drag and drop it over here. So in this section, what I'm basically going to do is I'm going to execute my query. I'm using this activity because I'm executing a non-query, right? My query has been assigned to a variable, so I just have to mention that variable's name. So I'm going to mention the variable's name, that is str query. And then in the properties section, I have to mention So I'm going to mention the database name, that is basically the database connection fund trace, that is the variable's name. And then what we're going to do is in the affected records, I'm going to mention the int affected records output. So that is what the output that we're going to mention, right? So this output, this variable will basically give you the output of all the values that were inserted into the database, right? Now once this is done, let me just quickly make sure that you can print these values. That means that you can view all the values that are inserted into your table, right? So for that, you'll just insert a write line activity, and then you'll say int affected records, that is basically our variable name, and convert it to string because it gives an output of a string value, right? So this is how you can create your complete sequence to automate these tasks. So let me just give you a review of all the steps again. So we started by creating a database, that is the MS Access database, and after that we made sure that our Outlook had few mails, and we made sure which folder had consisted that mails. After that, coming back to the UiPath Studio, we created a sequence inside which basically all the tasks, or you can mention all the actions that would be performed. And after that, we started with the get Outlook mail message. So over here, we mentioned this. We mentioned the account, that is basically my account over here, and then the mail folder through which it has to be read. And I've also mentioned the filters, that is the only unread messages, the mark as read, and the top 30, right? So basically what would happen is only unread messages would be read, and once they're read they would be marked as read, and only top 30 would be read. After that, we mentioned the output to be of list fund email, so all this output would be stored into this particular variable. Now for each item in list fund emails, we wanted a set of actions to be performed. So I've mentioned a for each loop, that is basically a for each workflow over here. And then, excuse me, and then in the body section we use various assign activities, right? So we wanted the from email address, the subject, the fund details, and then we use this variable for to avoid the exception. Then we also stored the array I'm sorry then we also store the array index values into the assigned variables, that is basically the fund transactions, fund quantity, and fund name. And once we have assigned all the variables, that is basically all the values to the variables, we had to connect to our database, right? So for that, we created a new subsequence, that is the database connect sequence, inside which I put in an assign activity to which I inserted the values, right? So I've basically mentioned the query. So if you see over here, I mentioned the query to be insert fund into fund transactions and the values, right? Now once that was done, we had to connect to our database, so I just configured the connection, and then our query would be executed. Once our query would be executed, we wanted the output to be printed, that is the output to be visible, so we just used the write line activity. So I hope the sequence was clear to you, right? So now let's just quickly check if our Outlook has some unread emails. So you can see that our Outlook has few unread emails. So now I'll just quickly run this sequence. So for that, I'm going to go to execute and choose debug. So I'm choosing debug because even if you have any error, then you can clearly understand which step is giving you an error, and then you can quickly solve it, and you can understand the workflow of each and every step, right? So we'll just choose debug. So you can see that the debug has started. That means our program has started executing. Once it executes, you'll see that it automatically closes, and you just go back to your dashboard, right? So let's just wait for that. Alright, so you can see that our execution has completed, right? So now let me just quickly close this particular hands-on database, and now we're going to open it again so that we see the output. So I'm going to enable content, and I'm going to enable the table's name. Alright, so as you can see that all your data has been retrieved to this particular database, right? So we stored the fund name, the request type, the request from, the status, the quantity, right? So the ID was generated automatically as and when the mails were read and the information was stored. The fund name, the request type was taken from the email subject. The request from was basically the from email address. Since I had sent it to myself, since I had sent it to myself, my email address is visible, and then the status is received. That means the information has been received, and the quantity is also mentioned, right? So that's how I think you can automate your task and make sure that the team did not have to do such humongous tasks manually. I showed you an example of around 11 emails, but yes, you can do this task for thousands of emails at a large production scale, so that you just don't employ people who just have work to manually set and process emails and then waste their time and energy, right? So you can just automate this task, and this happens quickly, and this saves your time also, right? So guys, that's all for today's session. I hope you found this session informative, and I hope you learned how to automate your emails, and you learned how to automate tasks with the help of UiPath Studio. So that's all for today's session from my side. If you had any doubts in this particular session, you can just comment down in our comment box, or you can just put it in the chat window, and we'll reply to it as soon as possible. So thank you, and have a great day.